the whole character is done. But there are a couple things you'll probably encounter in your character that this specific design wouldn't need. So I might as well tell you how to add all that stuff. Those things are textures and clothing. And at the end, I'll share some extra tidbits that you might want too. Let's start with textures first, since adding clothing tends to involve duplicating our body to use its parts as a starting point. So we might want to copy the data we add for texturing to it too, just in case. So how do textures work in 3D? We still use flat 2D images, but the way we apply them to 3D objects is by marking seams on the model and then cutting on those seams, so we can unwrap the model into a bunch of flat shapes that we can then apply the texture to and recombine them. Technically, you don't recombine them, but that's basically how it works. If you set it up right, you can paint straight on the model too. Here's how to set all that up. For the sake of the tutorial, I'll try to give this guy freckles. Since freckles are so small, we definitely can't just apply a material to a full face, like I showed you in the materials video. So first, we need to mark seams. Marking a seam is easy. The trouble comes in knowing where to mark them. If you just select any edge and press U, which will be the shortcut you use the most in texturing, it'll bring up this menu. At the bottom, press Mark Seam. It's also in the Edge menu in this bar, which you can also bring up with Ctrl E. That'll mark that edge in red, and the program will know to split the model in that area when we press Unwrap, which are the top options in the U menu. So where should we put all these seams? You'll understand these things more as we keep doing them, so you'll get a feel for what parts of the model you need to mark. In general, you want to make sure the split model has relatively even, rectangular faces, but here's where I usually mark for a human character. I want to separate the arms, legs, and neck, so I'll mark an edge around their shoulder, wrist, thigh, ankle, and both ends of the neck. Usually, you want to do this before you apply the mirror modifier, since you can then just mirror the seams across the body. But for now, we'll just have to deal with marking both sides. To see what's going on, let's unwrap it really quick. Press U, and then we get a couple of options. To be honest, I barely know what option to pick usually, so just pick the minimum stretch option. It sounds like something we want. It says it failed to unwrap some islands at the bottom, so we'll have to add some more seams, but let's see what we have anyway. So how do we look at all the split faces? Just split the window and change the panel type to UV editor. UV is the special term for these cut up pieces of the model. I looked it up for the video, and apparently U and V are actually the axes used for 2D images being applied to a 3D model, so the more you know. I thought it was an acronym, but it's not. Anyway, we can't see anything, since we don't have an image selected at the bottom. Press New so we can make one. It'll ask us what to call the image and how big we want it to be. I'll call it Freckles and make it around 2000 pixels big. You can drag across both dimensions to change them both at the same time. If you want more detailed textures or textures for the entire body, just be warned that this can also create a ton of lag, so just make it as big as you need and no bigger. Since I just want to add freckles to the face only, we can cheese some things, so I don't need to make it huge. You can also select the base color down here, but like I did in the materials video, I actually just want to use my texture as a factor input in my material, so I can decide what color I want my freckles to be later. So the base needs to be black, and I'll paint in white. With the image selected, it'll now show us some nets that are called the UV islands. If you select a few faces, it'll show you where those faces are on the UV. But there's a great new button in Blender 5.0 that you'll want. It's this arrows button down here. It'll sync your selection with your edit mode selection, which is extremely nice. Now you can see where each vert is placed on the UV. So this UV sucks in a lot of ways, so let's add more seams so we can fix it. For one, the arms, legs, and neck all fanned out into the circular net, which will stretch the texture super unevenly, so let's change that. If you select a vert on one seam, then follow that edge down to the other seam, and Shift-Control-Click, it'll select all the verts that would connect those two verts in the shortest path. This is definitely the easiest way to select a specific line of verts without selecting the whole loop. Now we can go up here to Tool and Live Unwrap. This will let us see the changes as we add them. And then add a seam. Now the arm is fanned out into more of a rectangle, which is exactly what our texture would want. Do the same for each limb and the neck. You want to place these seams somewhere that is generally pretty invisible, since it's usually pretty obvious where the texture cuts off from there being a seam. So I'll put mine in the back of the arms, and on the inside of his legs. That's a lot better. But the torso is really going nuts trying to stretch the shape into a flat one, so let's add some seams there. Let's make it so the front and back of the torso get split into separate islands, so we need to make sure no parts are connecting them. Add a seam to the shoulders and to the sides of the body. They're still joined at the crotch, so add a seam there too to separate them. Now it's good. The hand is also going nuts, so let's add seams in a similar way to the body. Let's add one around the base of each finger. The fingers will fan out like the arms did, but I'm not planning on putting any textures there, so I don't care. and then one that'll separate the top of the hand from the palm. Now I just got to do that all again. So this is why you usually do this before applying the mirror. If you use edge select mode, you can avoid selecting these faces in the middle, so it'll go a little faster. You don't usually want to select full faces when marking seams, since that'll fully separate that face from the rest of the UVs, which isn't very efficient. For the feet, just make a seam down the back and under the sole. The head is all that's left. I think the ear was one of the places that the program said messed up, so let's just add a seam around the front edge of it, so it just becomes some circle islands. I'm not adding any texture there, so who cares? But the face is the one place I am going to add a texture, so we need to do it a bit more right. Since you want to hide the seams, let's definitely put one around the back middle of the head, since that part is usually covered by hair. Usually, it's also broken up by the seam you put where the neck and the head meet, but I didn't connect the neck, so I'll add a seam that splits it from the part under each ear and down to where the neck is. Also, we definitely don't want the inside of the mouth to be attached to the rest of the head, so put a seam where the lips connect. That should be good. Getting UV seams perfect is definitely pretty hard, so let's just deal with those seams for now. We want to edit the UVs, but let's add a texture to the material so we can see how editing works. It's pretty simple. Just change to the shader editor, and with the white material selected, add in an image texture node. With this node, we can add an image to our material, and the program will apply it to our model using the UVs we set up. If you select this image icon on the left, you can select images that are already in our file. But let's make a new one that'll help us see what's happening. Make this 2000 pixels like the other one, but change the generated type to UV grid. This is a special texture that people use to help them edit UV islands. Just plug that node right into the output so we can only see what it's doing. This is using our UV islands to spread this texture across the body. Aside from some parts, it looks pretty good. If you want to put textures on the whole body, this is generally how you want the grid to look. Also, textures are only visible by default in the material preview and rendered views, but you can turn them on for solid view in the shading settings if you want. Back in the UV editor, let's change the image to our UV grid. Now we can move each of the UV verts in this view to change how the grid is being spread on the body. For example, if I select one of the UVs of one of the arms with L and rotate it around, you can see the texture changing. This is where the real pain of UVs comes in. If you need to do this professionally and perfectly, you want to make sure the UVs are resized and organized in such a way that each square of the grid is pretty much perfectly even across the body, and where the texture breaking around the seams is minimized. That's a ton of work. For one, I have this add-on called Myo3, which gives you a ton of buttons to help reorganize UVs. Definitely download that one if you ever really need to mess with UVs. But since we're just casual modelers, we just want to add some freckles to the face. We don't actually care about any island aside from the head. So, we just want to give as much real estate to the head as possible, and shrink all the rest down. Normally, you wouldn't even need to deal with the other seams in this case, but obviously I had to for the sake of the tutorial. Select the head island with L, and then under the Select tab, you can press Invert, or use the shortcut Ctrl-I to select everything else, then S to scale it down, and stick it in the corner or something. You can see how the super low resolution of these islands is affecting the texture. Now, just select the head, and scale it up as much as possible. Feel free to rotate it too, if it fits better that way. But we can make this even more optimized for us. Since we just want to add texture to the cheeks, we can actually select some verts on the face and scale up with proportional editing. Now the face is getting more texture real estate, and the back of the head is getting less. This should probably be good enough. You can even scale the UV out of bounds of the texture, but we don't need to go that far. It'll try and tile the texture for those parts of the UV, so you should try and avoid that if you can. Now to set it up so we can paint directly on the model. First, you need to make sure the image texture you want to paint on is selected in the image texture node in the material. Second, you need to make sure that the image texture is somehow connected to the output of the material you're planning to paint on. Third, the model needs to be UV unwrapped, so the UVs will be sorted in a usable way. That's it. You can go into texture paint mode in the 3D viewport, and then the image editor instead of the UV editor. The image editor lets us paint on the texture in a normal 2D fashion if you change it from view to paint down here. Then, in texture paint mode, you can just use these brushes to add color to the texture. But wait, why is it adding spots to the hair and eyes? That's because they're using the same material, but have their own UVs. So they're trying to interpret the freckle texture too. You could just unwrap them and put their UVs in the corner like the rest, but one thing I do is just give them a copy of the material that doesn't have a texture node in it. Just select one, press this number on their material to create a copy, and then in the shader editor, just remove the texture node from the copy. Doing the UVs wouldn't be that bad, but with more complex textures, I usually do this instead. Now I'll name the body one to body, and then the hair and eyes one to white simple. Don't forget that the teeth has the texture material too. Like I said before, I'll paint each freckle on the cheek white, so I can just use this image to place each freckle, and then I can change the freckle color in the shader editor. There's no eraser, so you just need to use the base color to erase stuff. Down here in the tool settings, you can also turn on symmetry, so it'll mirror each freckle. You might not want that, but it's there. It's only in the 3D viewport tool menu, since the image editor doesn't know what's symmetrical. If your model has the mirror modifier on while you paint, you'll only get half UVs, and all the painting will be mirrored by default, since it's using one UV for both sides. That could be more ideal for you if your whole model is going to be symmetrical anyway. If you don't want symmetry, make sure you apply the mirror modifier before you unwrap and edit the UVs. Also, if you want to change how hard or soft the brush is, that's under the fall off section. You can edit this curve to determine how soft the gradient is on the edge of the brush, or just use the presets at the bottom. This one is more airbrush-like, while this one is a hard circle. I'll use the hard fall off to make the freckles. This will also surely be pretty taxing on your computer, so definitely turn down the subdivision to paint faster. The simplify option I mentioned in the rigging video can be a big help here. While painting in 3D, know that the brush will stamp a circle on your view no matter where the model is. So if you brush it at a weird angle like this, you can see it stretches the brush effect across all that was visible. To make sure it works right, try to view the selection you're facing as flatly as possible, and make sure you don't let the brush extend off the edges. Also, use the wireframe so you actually know where the parts of the face are, since my texture is black. Now save your image. Saving your file does not save your image, so make extra sure you save your image in the image editor bar. It does put up a warning before you quit, but it's better to be sure. Now a big part to know about textures is how the Blender file reads textures. It's super important to save the texture in a super steady place that you won't ever change, because if the file tries to find the texture and fails, it'll turn bright pink. Remember that pink means a texture failure. So how does the file look for image textures? Basically, it follows a sort of path, starting at the .blend file your model is in. So if I save the image in the same folder as the blend file, it'll always remember the texture has this name and is saved in the same folder I'm in. That's a pretty reliable thing to do. So just remember to always move the blend file and the texture to the same spot, and it'll work. But if you save it in your pictures folder, for example, it'll always try to go, okay, back out to find local disk C, then go to users, pool, pictures, and then find the file that has this name, which has way more room for error. What I do is just have a models folder where all my blend files are in, and then I have a folder within that folder called textures, where I save all my texture images. That way, it'll always look for a folder called textures, and then look for the image, or maybe look for a dedicated folder for a character's textures, if the character has a lot of them, like my avatar. But if your texture does get messed up somehow, don't worry. Just go to the image texture node, select this folder button, and find the image yourself. It'll then remember that new location of the texture. Anyway, now that you know how to deal with textures, let's add it to the material for real. If you actually want the colors you painted onto your texture, it's easy. Just put the image texture node before your principal shader, and attach its color output to the shader's color input. That'll replace all color data from the shader with the image's colors. Or at least, that's what you do without this color ramp setup, since the ramp is changing the colors of whatever the shader is putting out. If your texture is like my Pikachu's texture, where it's in full color and spread across the whole body, you'll want to organize it like this, where it's plugged into one shader, but then I use a separate shader to just create a black and white shadow. So when I mix them together with the mixed color node, you can use the shadow ramp as a factor, plug the base into the top slot if you made the shadow white like I did, and make the bottom color whatever you want the shadow to be. You'll also want to set it to multiply, so it'll always make it darker than the base color, since we can't use one single shadow color for all the different colors on his body. But for the basic freckle texture, it's somewhat similar to that. I want to use this as a factor input to determine where the other color shows up. So right after the first color ramp, but before all the Fresnel nodes, I'll add a mixed color node, and plug the image node into the factor slot, and the base color into the A slot. Now that I'll use my image texture as a reference, which says, add the color in the B slot to the white parts of the image texture, so I can change the color on the fly, and I don't have to edit the image itself. I'll make them blue or something, since it matches the vibe of the rest of the character. Since it's glowing on top of the shadow, just switch the layer type to multiply, which will make the new color darker than whatever's on the base material. If you want to use this method for the shader, just do the same thing with the mixed shader node, but add another principled or emission shader to the B slot to determine the freckle color. Also, don't forget that you can still edit the texture when it's attached like this, so we'll make the smaller freckles a bit bigger. Your zoom does affect the brush size too. And that's it for real textures. But what if I told you there's a second, way quicker and easier way to get some stuff that resembles a texture, but doesn't need any UV unwrapping junk? It doesn't let us do hard image things like we would need with freckles, But what if we wanted a blush? Something like that could be perfect for this method. So let's add that. All we need is this mode, the Vertex Paint mode. This lets us create color attributes, which are kind of like textures, but they exclusively use vertices as a reference point. You essentially paint a color onto a vertex, hence the name, and reference that color data in the material. It'll create a gradient from that vertex to the surrounding ones, which is why it doesn't work for things like freckles. But if you wanted just a vague splotch of color, it's perfect. So here's how to use it. Down in this list, you need to create an attribute. I'll call it blush and choose its base color, which is black, since I want to do the same thing I did with the freckle texture in the factor, where I paint in white where I want the blush to be, but it works with any color. It doesn't have any resolution options because there's no resolution involved. It's always a clean gradient from one vert to another. We'll need to know where each vertex is, so turn on wireframe and all edges with your model, and turn off the outline solidify modifier, like always. Now just select the color to paint, and paint on a vertex. You can see it make a gradient from the color we painted to the surrounding verts. I'll use a soft fall off and turn on symmetry so I can quickly airbrush some parts around the cheeks. As you can see, it looks pretty alright for something that only took us less than a minute to set up. Now how do we attach it to the material? In the shader editor, just add a color attribute node and select the attribute you painted on. Now you can just add it on like you did with the image texture node. You put it into the color input of the principled shader to use its exact colors, or use it with a mixed color node to determine where the color in the B slot shows up. You can even keep painting on this even after it's set up, so you can add more blush to the rest of the body now that you know what it looks like. You can also attach a color ramp to make the gradient more harsh if you want. If you want to turn down the effect easily, take the white side and make it grayer, which will turn it down a bit. If you want to know a special use for this besides blush, my avatar's sweater actually uses color attributes to make this gradient. Since I wanted to transition from white to pink to purple, I used a color ramp to make the grayish part pink. I don't want to explain them in detail since I've already talked about enough, but it also uses a procedural texture for the stars, which you can add in the shader editor under the textures section. This one uses a Voronoi texture if you want to copy it. Procedural textures are a whole different beast, so I'll say save that for a different tutorial. You can do a lot of crazy stuff with them. I also recently made this video where I go into the new stylized material setup I'm using for my characters, which uses color attributes for a ton of different things, like even deciding where shadows get darker. They're super handy, and that video has a ton of material tidbits you could learn from. Anyway, enough about textures. Let's get on to clothes. So you're probably wondering, why are we doing the clothes now instead of before? The main answer is that I think this guy looks good enough without them, and this series was already long enough, so I didn't want to add even more on top of that. But the other reason is that the easiest way to make simple clothes is to duplicate a part of the body, meaning if we waited until after rigging and texturing and all that, we can duplicate all that data onto the clothes with basically no effort. Here's how. First, select the part of the body that closely matches the shape of the clothes you want, using X-ray view and brush select with C, or just whatever works. I'll add a sweater, so I'll select a bunch of the upper torso, and then all of the arms. Shift D to duplicate, right click to reset any movement, and P to separate into another object. Now in edit mode with the sweater, just Alt S to scale it out a bit to put it on top of the body. Now all we need to do is add a solidify modifier, so it has some more thickness, like cloth. Move it under the armature modifier and above the subdiv, and then give it a new material. I'll copy over the white simple material by pressing this number next to its name. And then in the shader editor, we can just make it a different color. Remember to change all the colors down the line. Now he has a sweater. And look, if we move the rig, the sweater already moves perfectly in sync with him, since the sweater copied all the bone weights the arms already have. Let's even scale out a part of his sleeve. And I'll put this inner bit here too, to add a bunched up bit, adding a 0.5 crease to the point and the outer part. I'll also add a sharper crease to the edges of the sleeves, the bottom of the main part, and the neck area, so it has the cuff areas like actual clothes do. It all still follows the rig, even after the changes. But obviously, you don't always want to wait until after rigging to add the clothes. So here's how to get to work with the rig if you rig the main body separately. It's actually super simple. First, you need the main body to be rigged how you want it, because we're going to use a modifier to copy the weights over to the sweater, which doesn't have any right now. Parent the sweater to the rig, but it doesn't matter what option you select, since the weights are going to be replaced. On the sweater, add the data transfer modifier, and put it right at the top. We just need to choose what data to transfer here. So at the top, use the eyedropper to select the body to transfer from. Then check vertex data, and then open it up and select vertex groups, since all armature weights are vertex groups. Now just press the generate data layers, and it'll copy all the weights of the body onto the closest spots on the sweater. Apply the modifier, since we don't want it to keep repeatedly doing that as the model moves. Now it's all good. The sweater follows the body even after rigging was done without it. This is a super important method to learn, because when it comes to clothes with a lot of detached parts, they will very rarely follow the rig perfectly when you parent with automatic weights. You'd have to do a ton of meticulous weight painting to get it all to work, but if you have a solid body to reference underneath, you can just data transfer all the weights from the body to all the different parts of the clothes, and it'll work much better. A good example of where I needed to do this was all my digital circus characters. If you look underneath their clothes and turn off the mask modifier I put in, they all have a sort of body underneath, even though I never actually planned on removing their clothes, or even giving them different outfits. The data transfer method is just that useful. With someone like Pomni, who has all these different separated parts, literally all I had to do was just parent the main body with auto weights, and then data transfer those weights onto the clothes, and her body rig was pretty much done. But there's another modifier that would be insanely useful if you're making complex clothes, and I'll use Ragatha as an example. Her dress has pretty big faces, but I need to make these patches and stitches map to her dress perfectly. Data transfer doesn't work here, since transferring a big faces vertex groups to a bunch of small faces vertex groups doesn't work all that well. It gets close, but not close enough. But if you use the surface deform modifier, it'll perfectly map to the surface of the dress, no matter what. Add it to the thing you want to bind to the clothes or the body, in my case, the stitches and patches, and put it all at the end of the modifier stack. Now, select the object you want to bind the object to, which is the dress in my case. Then press bind. Now it'll bind one object to another, and it'll follow it perfectly. Except, this is one of the most whiny modifiers in the whole program. If we go into edit mode with the dress, it'll still work if you just move the verts around, but watch what happens if I add a loop. My god. This modifier works great if you keep all the resolution exactly how it was when you press the bind button on the modifier, but if anything changes, it breaks. The worst part is that it breaks when you turn up the subdivision modifier. It also breaks when you turn it down too, but in a much more quiet way. So you need to make sure you bind the object to the base object at the exact resolution you want it to be at the end. And I mean exact. The subdiv modifier needs to be at that level of subdivision in the render slot specifically, or it'll suddenly break when you render it out. If I keep talking, this will just turn into a rant. So this is all to say that the surface deform modifier is super useful, but also super finicky. What I do is bind at the normal subdivision level that I want to render with, and if I want to turn down the subdivs with the simplify option, I'll just hide the parts that broke off the mesh. As long as I keep the camera option in the outliner on, they'll reappear when I render, and will map to the dress perfectly. But anyway, that's pretty much all you need to know about making clothes. The rest of it is just knowing how to model clothes well, which would basically require a whole different video. And this series has already gone on long enough. Let's end this whole thing off with some little tips and additions that you might want to know about. Since we just came off from making clothes, here's a tip I usually use for making symmetrical shoes. First, select one foot, duplicate, separate, scale it out a bit, add solidify, and add a new material. Now I want to mirror it, so I'll select the middle line of the shoe, press V to split it, and then press L on the inner side to select it, and delete it. Add the mirror, and turn on clipping, but it's mirroring across the middle, since that's where the body's origin point was, so move each mirrored part together so they get glued. Now what we can do is move it in object mode, back to the other foot. And then add a second mirror modifier. One thing with the second mirror that we can do is change what object we're mirroring against. By default, it's the object itself, but we can select the body, so it'll then use the body's origin point for the mirror instead. Now, since that mirror is after the first mirror, it'll mirror across the foot first, and then mirror across the whole body onto the other foot second. Now you can edit the shoe, and its changes will transfer to both sides and the other foot. You could even completely uncheck merge, since we would never want the shoes to merge in the middle here. Sometimes you might want to add clothes that don't perfectly cover the base body, so you might want to hide certain parts of the body when the clothes are visible. This is easy, just add a mask modifier to the body. It doesn't really matter where in the stack it is, as far as I know. This needs a vertex group to work, so add one. Call it shirt mask or something, and we can select a couple of vertices in edit mode and apply a value of 1 to that area. We can then select it in the mask modifiers section. By default, it'll hide all that wasn't a part of the vertex group, but you can press these arrows to reverse it, so it'll hide what you did select, and then just turn the mask modifier on and off depending on whether they have clothes on. But it takes all the faces attached to the verts you selected too, so we actually want to go back and remove some of the verts from the top, so it'll look normal when the mask is active. This part isn't working perfectly, but that's probably just because this is a sloppy example. For another modifier trick, we can actually change a lot of things in modifiers using vertex groups that aren't tied to an armature. One I use a lot is creating a vertex group to change the thickness of a solidify modifier in certain places, instead of the whole mesh evenly. Let's do this for the eyelashes. Add a vertex group, and I usually just call it Solidify so I know what it's for. In the Solidify modifier, we can apply this vertex group to it here. For some reason, it doesn't react until I apply a weight, but once I do, it will completely flatten out, since we haven't added any values to the group yet, meaning it's now reducing its thickness to 0% of its base thickness, which is obviously flat. But in edit mode, with the group selected, if we select everything, turn the value up to 1, and apply, it'll return all the thickness, since it's saying to use 100% of the thickness. But we can now go into certain areas and apply, for example, a value of 0.5, so those verts will only be half as thick as the rest of it. I'll use this so that the area near the nose shrinks in, but you can use this however you want. You can also press these arrows to reverse the effect, so it's more like saying to subtract that percent from the base 100%. I usually check that, so I can leave most of the group at 0, and just add value to the areas I want to be thinner. We can do a similar thing to add a cartoony eye shine to his eyes. In edit mode, turn off the shrink wrap for now. Make sure you have the base's shape key selected. Duplicate the iris and shrink it down near to where the shine would go. Then create a new material for the eye and turn it into a white emission shader so it just glows, and call it shine. Apply it to the new circle. If we turn on the shrink wrap, you can see that the shine starts clipping into the eye, since they are in the exact same spot. But we can use a vertex group to tell it to shrink wrap the shine part just a tiny bit less than the iris, so it'll always appear slightly on top. Create a vertex group and call it shrink wrap. Select everything with A, then apply 1 to everything, so it'll shrink wrap 100%. Now just select the shine with L, then turn it down to 0.99 and apply it to there. Add it to the modifier, and now the shine is always on top of the iris. It looks a little funky, so I usually change the wrap method to target normal project for better results. Since we already had shape keys on the iris, and the shine is just a copy of the iris, it already has all the shape keys and drivers we set up for it. Only the size one's messed up, so redo those. You're also going to have to do it for the mirrored side, but I won't, since I don't want this effect for this guy. And the last modeling tip, using a spherical eye. I'll make a UV sphere, rotate it so its top point is facing forward, apply all the usual modifiers and materials, and apply the black material to the front. This is workable if you're making a more realistic character whose face can work with a truly spherical eye, but if you're making a character that's slightly stylized, you might want to squish it down so it's a bit flatter in the front. But how do you rotate it to make them look around? That's not how eyes work. We can use something else to fix that. Turn it back into a sphere, then click it, and in the Add menu, go to Lattice and Lattice Deform selected. Then Ctrl P to parent it to the lattice with Lattice Deform. Lattices let you squish down an object without editing its actual self, which has a ton of uses. This is a new option in 5.0, which makes the lattice fit the object right away. So if you're in an older version, you'll have to add a plain lattice and scale it to fit the object, and then parent with Lattice Deform. Now, if we scale down the lattice in object mode, it'll squish down our eye, but you can actually still grab the eye and rotate it, and it'll stay squished thanks to the lattice. This is the type of eye I normally use for my characters. But how do you rig it? Well, the same way you rig a spherical eye normally, but, since I haven't told you all that, I'll tell you now. Select it, move the 3D cursor to selected with Shift S, then add a bone and tilt it forward so it's sticking out of the iris. Then duplicate it and put it in front of the eye. We're going to make the eye bone always point to the forward bone, so you can decide where to make the character look. So on the eye bone, add a damped track bone constraint to it, and select the front bone in the constraint. Now it's following the front bone when we move it. Then we need to make the eye copy its rotation, so add a copy rotation constraint in the object constraints section, and select the eye bone in that constraint. Then we want to set both of these world spaces down here to local space, and then change replace to add, so it keeps the rotation we had before, and just adjusts it according to the eye bone. If we move it, you can see it's not following right, so we need to invert it on the Z-axis. That'll be perfect. You can also add a third bone to the middle of the face, and parent the front bone to it. So if you parent the other eye's front bone to it too, you can move both eyes at the same time, which is way more convenient. Now how do we parent all this to the head bone of our rig? We need to keep moving the lattice along with it. It's pretty easy. To parent the lattice, select it, and then select the rig, and go into pose mode. Select the head, Ctrl P, and parent to the bone. Now the lattice is following the head, and since the lattice pulls along the eye, it works. For the eye bone, in edit mode with the rig, just select the eye bone, then the head bone, and parent with keep offset. That's all you need to do. You can parent the eye master bone to the head too, but it isn't as necessary, since you might want your character to look at a steady object while the head moves. In that case, you could use a child of constraint to parent it to the head, so you can turn off the parent when you need to. This is how the setup looks in my rigs, with all the custom bone shapes set up too. Since I mentioned in the rigging video that posing is super important for appeal, here's some tips on how to pose your character. The big one, I think, is to just move as many body parts as possible. Here, if I try to make a pose of him with his hand on his hip, it obviously looks super boring if I just move the hand to his hip. But then I'll move the hips out and turn the head. Then I can move the feet so they're pointing in different directions. Posing the fingers so they're less evenly spaced, and moving his shoulders a bit too. I feel like people forget how important the shoulders are for posing. And of course, giving him a facial expression. And messing with some of the tweak bones. You can really feel the appeal increase with each part moved. Our bodies are rarely ever super still, so when we pose, we don't keep our parts super symmetrical. Aside from that, also heavily consider lots of principles that make 2D art appealing, like having a clear silhouette. I highly recommend just grabbing parts and moving them around to make them look appealing just from the camera view. Don't worry about making the character look normal from all angles unless you're animating a shot where you see them from all angles. As an animation tip, I want to show you how to render your animation as a video. By default, you have to render each frame as an image, and then put all the images together to re-render them as a video. But there is a way to instantly turn them into a playable MP4 file. In the Output tab, in the Output section at the bottom, switch the media type to video, but that won't save it as an MP4 by default, which is a format that's much easier to play and share. Down here under Encoding, change the container to MPEG-4, the video codec to H.264, and if there's audio playing with the animation, change the audio codec at the bottom to AAC. Then, if you press Render Animation at the top, it'll instantly turn your animation into a video once it's done. You'll want to select the file location it'll save at the top here though, so you know where to find it. That's also where you name it. Also, if you want to know how to render a transparent animation like I use for my avatar, you need to go to this Film section in the Render tab and check Transparent, which will delete the background. Then, instead of rendering with MPEG-4, render with QuickTime and QuickTime Animation, and make sure the RGBA is selected, since that's color plus alpha, or transparency. This also works for images, but you need to check PNG and RGBA as you're saving it so it'll stay transparent. Even though this video has gotten pretty long already, I brought it up, so I'll tell you how to add audio so you can animate to it. Split the panel, but change the new panel to the video sequencer. This is a rudimentary video editor that Blender has, but to use it for our animation, click on this droplet icon and select the scene that already exists. If you're not in version 5.0 or later, you don't have to do this. But now you can just go to Add, Sound, and once you select an audio file, place it on the timeline, probably at the very start. Then, if you press play, you can hear it. The whole character is done. Since you'll definitely want it, then go to the playback section of the timeline and toggle on audio scrubbing, so you can hear a bit of the audio when you move the playhead around. That's basically necessary for pacing animation to audio well. Also, don't forget about the frame dropping setting I mentioned in the rigging video. Audio will never lag, so if your animation is lagging, it'll completely desync everything, so you need to have frame dropping on. And the last true tip, I'll walk you through how my cosmetic scene works, since a lot of people seem to want to know. I won't tell you how to build it though, since that would take too long. If you just want it, you can get it for free on my Gumroad. The floor is pretty simple. It just uses the spherical texture to determine where the transparent edge is, since it's actually a square plane in reality. These nodes in the back move the texture to the right spot, so its center point is in the middle of the plane. For the starry background, to see what's going on, you have to switch this part of the shader editor from object to world. Then, these are the nodes it uses. This part is a blue gradient behind everything, and you can change its colors with the color ramp, or change the gradient to linear if you want this look. Then the stars are just a Voronoi texture, but I use this color ramp to shrink it down so the stars are smaller. I use a similar thing for my avatar's sweater stars, if you noticed. This gradient area on the ramp lets there be some dimmer stars for some variation. The texture coordinate nodes in the back are important too, since they decide how they're shown. The gradient is using window size, so it'll match the size of the view no matter what. But the stars are set to generated, so you can rotate around and see different stars. Then they're added together and plugged into this background node. This whole section lets you change the actual color light the world is making, while separating it from the actual background's color. So the bottom part is just what is visible, but the top part is the actual light in the scene. You can turn it to black to replicate a darker scene. In that case, I also detached the gradient section so it's a pitch black sky. Some people were saying that it all used HDRIs, which are 360 images, but no, it's actually just nodes. And that's it. If I ever think of more tips and tricks, I'll make a new video for them, and I'll probably add them to the playlist for this whole series. I did also add a tips section to my Discord server, and if you want it, I released the model I built throughout the series on Gumroad for free if you want to download it and sort of check your work or whatever. The link will be below. I guess I already did the big send-off in the last video, so for now I'll just reiterate that I'd love to see what you made using this series. Seeing people get use out of these videos is what makes all the effort worth it, so feel free to send it in to my Discord server, or just tag me wherever else you post it if you want. You don't have to, since it's technically your own work, but yeah, whatever. Also, I did sort out my Patreon if you want to support me. I'm not hurting for cash, but any extra help means I'll be able to focus more and more on my art. You'll gain access to a special supporter section on my Discord server, and I'll also always post updates on whatever I'm working on there, so you'll always know what I'm up to. Definitely let me know what other benefits you might want though, since I don't really know what people want the most when it comes to stuff like that. I'm willing to tweak it however people want it. Go to my Linktree to see all my other accounts, and thanks for watching through the whole series if you did. Wait, I should probably do one of those secret word things. If you watch through the whole series, add a barrel to your comment so I can know.